The juror, verdict of guilt. The courtroom was tense, filled with the weight of the decision that would soon be made. The jurors had been deliberating for hours, and now they were ready to deliver the verdict. The defendant, a disheveled man in his mid-30s, sat anxiously at the defense table, eyes darting between the jurors and his attorney. He had maintained his innocence from the beginning, but the evidence against him had been damning. Among the jurors, one figure remained particularly calm. Jonathan Fields, a middle-aged man with an unassuming demeanor, sat with his hands folded neatly on his lap. He'd been meticulous throughout the trial, taking notes, asking questions during deliberations, and ensuring that the jury considered every detail of the case. To the other jurors, he was a model of fairness and integrity. As the foreman of the jury, Jonathan stood when the judge asked for the verdict. "Have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice echoing through the hushed courtroom. "We have, Your Honor," Jonathan replied, his voice steady. The judge nodded for him to proceed. "In the case of the State versus Michael Graves, we the jury find the defendant guilty." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The defendant's shoulders slumped, his face a mask of despair. The victim's family, seated in the front row, began to weep softly, holding each other as relief washed over them. Justice, it seemed, had been served. Jonathan remained composed as the judge thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. As he walked out of the courthouse, he couldn't help but notice the swarm of reporters outside, cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward anyone willing to speak. Jonathan sidestepped the crowd, slipping away unnoticed. He had no interest in the spotlight. That night, Jonathan returned to his modest suburban home. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat down at the small desk in his study. The room was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the walls. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It was worn, the pages yellowed with age. As he flipped through it, the pages revealed a meticulous account of every detail of the trial, every piece of evidence, every witness testimony, and every interaction with the other jurors. But the notebook also contained something else, something far more sinister. On one of the pages was a detailed plan, outlined in neat handwriting. It was the blueprint of a murder, from the initial stalking of the victim to the exact moment the crime was committed. Jonathan's eyes traced the lines of the plan, a plan he had executed to perfection. The victim, Paul Atwater, had been a wealthy businessman with a reputation for ruthlessness. Years ago, he had destroyed Jonathan's life, using his power and influence to ruin Jonathan's career and leave him with nothing. Jonathan had never forgotten, and he had never forgiven. For years, he had nurtured his hatred, planning his revenge in secret. When the opportunity finally came, Jonathan acted with precision. He had followed Paul's routines, learning his habits, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He knew that the police would focus on Michael Graves, a former employee of Paul's, who had a history of violence and a motive to kill. Jonathan had planted just enough evidence to lead the investigation straight to Michael, knowing that it would only be a matter of time before he was arrested. The trial had been the final step in Jonathan's plan. As a juror, he had carefully guided the deliberations, ensuring that the jury reached the right verdict. The guilty verdict had been inevitable. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He had done it. He had committed the perfect crime and ensured that someone else paid the price. Justice, in his mind, had been served. But as he sat there, sipping his whiskey, a faint unease began to creep into his thoughts. The trial was over, but the consequences of his actions were just beginning. Had he been too confident? Had he left any loose ends? He shook off the doubt. He had been thorough, careful. There was no evidence linking him to the crime. The police believed they had their man, and the case was closed. Still, as the night wore on and the shadows in the room grew longer, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He closed the notebook and locked it away in the drawer, trying to dismiss the nagging sense of unease. In the coming days, life returned to normal. The media frenzy surrounding the trial died down, and the world moved on. But for Jonathan, the victory felt hollow. He had achieved his revenge, but the thrill of it had faded, leaving only an empty void. Then, one evening, a letter arrived. It was addressed to him, with no return address. Jonathan's heart raced as he opened it, his fingers trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with a simple message typed in bold letters. "I know what you did." Jonathan's blood ran cold. He looked around the room, half expecting someone to be watching him. But he was alone. The letter had no signature, no clues as to who might have sent it. He crumpled the paper in his hand, trying to suppress the rising panic. Who could possibly know? He had covered his tracks, eliminated all evidence. Yet the letter was undeniable proof that someone, somewhere, had seen through his deception. Over the next few days, more letters arrived, each one more threatening than the last. Whoever was behind them knew everything, details that only the killer could know. Jonathan's carefully constructed world began to unravel as paranoia consumed him. He became reclusive, avoiding contact with anyone, fearing that his secret would be exposed. Finally, in a moment of desperation, Jonathan decided to confront the situation head-on. He retraced his steps, searching for any clue that might lead him to his tormentor. But the trail was cold, and the more he searched, the more the walls closed in on him. One night, unable to bear the pressure any longer, Jonathan returned to the scene of the crime, the secluded spot where he had taken Paul's life. As he stood there, the memories flooded back, vivid and haunting. He could almost hear Paul's final, desperate pleas for mercy. But there was something else too, a presence, watching him from the shadows. Jonathan's breath quickened as he turned, his eyes darting through the darkness. But no one was there. His mind played tricks on him, the fear and guilt warping his perception. In the end, he was left standing alone in the night, a broken man haunted by his own sins. The next morning, Jonathan was found dead in his study, a single gunshot wound to the head. The police ruled it a suicide, a tragic end to a man who had been unable to cope with the aftermath of a traumatic trial. But as the investigators searched his home, they discovered the leather-bound notebook, hidden away in the desk drawer. And within its pages, they found the truth, a confession written in Jonathan's own hand, detailing every aspect of the murder and his role in framing Michael Graves. The case that had seemed so clear-cut was now anything but. The real murderer had been the one who sat in judgment, the one who had passed the verdict, all the while concealing his own guilt. As the news broke, the public was left in shock, unable to comprehend the twisted irony of it all. Justice had been served, but not in the way anyone had expected. And as the story faded from the headlines, the memory of Jonathan Fields lingered, a chilling reminder that sometimes the real monster is the one you least suspect. Like and subscribe for more crime stories and the hunt for justice.